And as we see that happening, we are actually more confirmed than ever that we are in these last days. Roman numeral 4 in your outline, the first Jewish revolt in 66, we had started to talk about this a bit yesterday. Jerusalem was initially surrounded by armies. The believers were remembering the words of Jesus. Verse 20 here, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, recognize that her desolation is at hand. Luke chapter 21, verse 20. Then let those who are in Judea is the province surrounding Jerusalem, flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of the city, the Ir HaKodesh, Jerusalem, let them depart. How can you depart? Well, we had mentioned the other day that the Roman armies initially thought that they would gain a quick victory, and they were beaten back only to realize that the zealots, the rebels, had dug in, had gotten lots of supplies, years' worth of supplies, and it was going to be a long, tough fight. So they withdrew from the city. They went back down to Caesarea on the coast, which is was a gigantic Roman fort. You can still see the ruins of the fort. It was a fortified city where the boats came in from Rome, so it was very, very well supplied. And so the armies departed, it's just a few days' march back down to the coast, and people were panicking. What should we do? Are the Romans going to come back? Did we beat them? Do they realize that they can't defeat us? Maybe they're going to go away permanently. Other people are saying, no, they're going to come back, and your one protection is going to be by going inside the walls of Jerusalem. Because when the Romans come back, they're going to ravage the countryside, and if you're just in a small enclave of a dozen people, they're going to murder all of you. So come into the city. The walls of Jerusalem will be our protection, and beside that, they would say, the glory of God resides in Jerusalem. The Shekinah glory of God is here. It inhabits the temple. That's what they were telling each other. Of course, that ignored the sad reality that the book of Ezekiel records the departure of Shekinah, the departure of the Holy Spirit of God because of their idolatry. And so, no, those walls did not offer any protection when the Romans came back. So the Jewish believers, hearing these words of Jesus, fled to the mountains and then across the river into the next district, into the district of Pella, which is kind of modern-day Jordan. Let me recommend a book, and I was surprised I don't have it in your bibliography here or in my notes or recommendations. There's a simple book. Well, it's not so simple, actually. It has one goal, and that is to teach the history of Jewish Christianity. And the name of the book is The History of Jewish Christianity. It's a free download. You just need to search that title. The author's name is Hughh Schoenfield, Schoenfield. If you search that in an internet search engine, you will find a free PDF. I'll tell you a quick personal story. 2.5 years after I came to saving faith, my father also came to faith. In a very definite moment, he absolutely came to faith. From that moment, my father was immensely interested in the history of the Messianic Jewish movement. He was a book guy who had lots and lots of books in the house because his father was a book guy as well, and I inherited some of those books. My father heard about this book by Hughh Schoenfield. Very quickly, Hughh Schoenfield was an individual in Britain who was an academic. He was a young man. He was a researcher. He was on a fast track to a PhD. He was doing research at Oxford. Okay? He was very competent in the languages. He was competent in Hebrew. He was competent in Greek. He had been raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, but had left that behind and had professed faith in Jesus as the Messiah. He became the boy star of the Messianic movement in Britain in the early 1930s. In that capacity, he was given stipends and grants to go around to all of the academic institutions to construct a history of Jewish Christianity. He went to Israel, he went to Istanbul, he went to a number of places in order to conduct the research. The result was this book, The History of Jewish Christianity. My father heard about the book. The book was completely out of print. Why? Because Hugh Schoenfeld, in 5 or 6 years after he wrote the book, renounced his faith. He said, well, I believe Jesus was a great rabbi, but no longer believe he was the Messiah, no longer believe he was God. Hugh Schoenfeld would have a hard fall because by the 1960s, he would write a blockbuster bestseller called The Passover Plot. And The Passover Plot would go to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and it was a work of fiction. It was a work of fiction. It is a false tale. But he used historical events of the New Testament to concoct the story that Jesus did not die on the cross. Rather, he was given a knockout drug on that sponge that would kind of paralyze him and knock him out. The disciples purposely did this. They gave him this on a sponge, not merely to wet his lips, but so that he would drink this. Then they took his body down from the cross. They nursed him back to health. This is the improbable, impossible plot of the Passover plot. If you read it, you could plotz, which is a Yiddish word meaning you'd faint. It just doesn't make any sense. It sold big time, and it influenced lots of people in this new theory that Jesus actually swooned on the cross. But my father, when hearing about the original book, The History of Jewish Christianity, wrote a letter. It's on paper, you put a stamp on it. If you kids need an explanation, I'll explain that later. And wrote a letter and mailed it to Great Britain, where a rare bookseller was advertising a copy of the book for about $100. This is in like 1979, 1980. My father paid and received that book, and I still have a copy of the original book, The History of Jewish Christianity. The good news is it's now available as a free download as a PDF, and a number of you have actually downloaded that book. That book was used heavily by Arnold in his book that I'm holding here, The Remnant of Israel. And much of the material in this course can also be accessed here in this book, The Remnant of Israel by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum. Highly recommend this, but he will quote and he will cite from Schoenfeld's book on a number of occasions. It's an important book. The Jewish community, the mainstream Jewish community doesn't like it much because it shows just how Jewish those early years of the faith movement in Jesus was. That's a very important phrase. So it's oftentimes from both the writings of Hugh Schoenfeld and later church writings that the following narration is put together. So the Jewish believers are now in Pella. They are across the river. They're across on the other side of the Jordan. And the reason they were safe there is because the Jews of that Roman province were not rebelling against Rome. Once again, the entire Jewish world did not rebel in 70 AD, but it was the 3 central provinces around Israel. The Jews of what is modern-day Jordan said, no, we're not going to war against Rome. These are the cities of refuge in the Old Testament to which people would run if there was a problem. So the Jewish believers were there. So this was a dilemma. The Jewish believers had now left the city. Imagine the scene. Here, the Romans are now going back to Caesarea on the coast. And the Jewish people are saying amongst themselves, take up arms. Use this opportunity to rearm yourself. Call in all the young men from the countryside because the Romans are coming back. And when they come back, we'll need every man. And so the Jewish believers in Jesus would have heard this as they left the city. And as they left the city, people would have said to them, why are you leaving the city? You need to stay here and help us and fight. You say you're Jews, you say you're loyal to the Jewish community. Show it by staying here, taking up arms, and helping us defeat the Romans when they come back. But the Jewish believers are remembering the words of Messiah Jesus, recorded here in Matthew chapter 21. When you see the city surrounded, know that its time is near. To what directive would they have loyalty? Would they have loyalty to the people of Israel or to the God of Israel? And ultimately, of course, they had to say, we know the command of the God of Israel. He commanded us to leave the city. So as they left, people would shout after them, Shmad, Shmad, destroyers. If we lose this battle, it's your fault. The word shmad is a Hebrew word for destruction. And so in the present tense, the participle form of that became known as Meshumadim, the destroyers. And this was a title that really stuck in later years when the city actually had been destroyed. Before the destruction, they would have only been taunted with this idea that you're traitors, you're turning your back on your people. Once the city was destroyed, however, it became easy for the mainstream Jewish community to say, Meshumadim, you are destroyers. As a brand new Jewish believer, I heard this term hurled at myself from the people in the community. Because this is the typical story. You were naive. You say, I'm going to go and sit down with my rabbi and show him what I've learned. And he may become convinced. And typically that did not happen. Typically you were just simply, at first they tried to reason with you. Has there been any problems in your family? Why are you doing this? You have girl problems? You have this? What is the real reason you're doing this? That you're breaking your parents' heart? Why are you making your grandparents roll over in their grave? This is, real light-duty stuff. They would just push the knife in, and they would use any emotional means to make you feel guilty. And ultimately, they would say, you are a meshumad. You are a traitor. You are contributing to the destruction of your family, of your people. And then the final piece, which was the most emotional piece. What Hitler could not do, you are attempting to do. You are completing the job of Hitler because you're going to marry a girl who's not Jewish, you're not going to raise your children as Jews, and that would be the end of your family. You're breaking your parents' heart. These are heavy-duty things in the late 70s that many of us who came to faith during that time period, these are the things we heard because our generation, our parents were the generation who saw the Holocaust. And in my immediate neighborhood, this gigantic housing project that was 85% Jewish, we had many Holocaust survivors. They were not old and frail. They were in the midst of their working years because they were younger in the 60s and 70s. And so all of this goes back. The initial part of this would start with this first Jewish revolt against Rome, where they were, for the first time, accused of shmad, of being traitors. Yet they went to Rome, and Jerusalem was destroyed. In your outline, capital B there, it says there, mainstream Judaism will reinvent itself in Yavne, or Jamnia is the typical academic phrase that you often see, in the year 90 AD. So the destruction occurred in 70 AD. 3 years later, the fortress, the Herodian fortress at Masada, is then taken by the Romans. They held out for an additional 3 years. And so now Judaism is destitute. It is, it's like on the road and it has to go someplace else. The Romans forbade for a time period, that wasn't permanent, but the Romans forbade Jews from living in the city. Even though that happened, many Jews still did live in the city. A number of people were able to stay. And so in 90 AD, the rabbis are now facing a problem. It took them 20 years to pick themselves out of the dust of the destruction of Jerusalem. The Sadducees are gone. The Sadducees were committed to the temple. They went down with the ship. The Sadducees went down with the temple. No more Sadducees. But the Pharisees, they were all around because they had been portable. As a result of the Babylonian captivity, there was this new invention of the teachers, of the rabbis. So the Pharisees were portable. The Jewish believers in Messiah Jesus were also portable. Both groups grew. So that's the headline here. Both of these Jewish groups grew. The Pharisaic group would tighten the wagons, to use an American phrase. They would circle the wagons against the enemies outside, and they would seek now to define who was in and who was out. And friends, this is going to be one of the big themes of Jewish history. Who's in, who's out? They looked at the believers in Jesus and said, hey, those were the guys who left the city when we needed them most. They are meshumadim. They committed shmad. And we're going to mark them as being no longer welcome in the community. And so all of the phrases where Jesus had warned the disciples, you think I've come to bring peace? No, I've come to bring a sword. I'm going to turn father against son, mother against daughter. In your own household, these will be your enemies. And that's exactly what happened to many Jewish households. They will throw you out of the synagogue thinking they're doing God a favor, is another phrase we see in the New Testament. That's exactly what happened. So in 90 AD, one of the things that was most significant there is, first of all, they had to basically institutionalize the idea that Judaism was portable. They didn't ever expect the Romans to allow them to reconstruct the temple. That hope was now gone. And they had already had practice with the synagogue system. There were synagogues in Egypt. The gigantic Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt, was functioning well. They didn't rebel against the Romans. It was a very wealthy community. It was enriched by trade across the Mediterranean. They were doing well. The Jewish community in Babylon was doing well. The Jewish community up in Asia Minor doing well. And so that was the future. And they had to rewrite Judaism. They had to reshuffle Judaism. They had to reimagine it to make it portable. And the beginnings of this happened, and it's in your notes there, at the Council of Yavne. This period between the two events, be in your outline. Mainstream Judaism will reinvent itself in Yavne. And one of the main things they did is they took a set of basically benedictions. The word Shmona Esrei is best known in the Jewish community as a set of prayers, a set of benedictions. But it's also a number. Shmona Esrei. Shmona is 8, Esrei is 10. It's the 18 benedictions. Shmona Esrei, the 18 benedictions. To these 18 benedictions, which are sort of pronouncements, the Council of Yavne added a 19th benediction. So if you look at the 18 benedictions in any rabbinic text, you can go to Sepharia online, a free website. It's an academic website that allows you access to Jewish texts for free in Hebrew and English and other languages. And you look for the 18 benedictions, or the Shmona Esrei, and you actually see a list of 19. The 19th benediction they added was this, and I'll quote it. For the sectarians, for the menim, the sectarians, let there be no rest or hope. That was added as a curse upon the Jewish believers. There are a number of Jewish believers who will frequent the synagogue from time to time, and sometimes in certain communities they'll recite the Shmona Esrei. And if you recite the full thing, you're actually reciting a curse against yourself. This is something that people are not recognizing. But this would now be codified, and from this point onward, mainstream Judaism would now start to define itself in contradistinction about what we are not. And more, they would not define themselves by what we are, but rather they would define themselves, well, we are not this. And that came about because of the growing involvement of Christians and the growth of Christianity. So that's where we'll pick it up in just a half an hour.